Today I'll be reading you a bedtime story, and it's a throwback Thursday because I wrote it many, many years ago. It's called Lester's Pawn Shop. Lester's Pawn Shop stood on Christopher Street and had for quite some time. It was owned and run by Lester Burke, but it hadn't always been that way. Lester's Pawn Shop had stood on Christopher Street before Lester Burke was old enough to walk, let alone manage a store. At that time, it was owned and run by Lester Burke Sr. Now, it was owned and run by Lester Burke. Lester Burke was sitting by the window in the back of the shop, smoking a cigarette, when the small bell over the door announced somebody's entry. He got up and made his way to the front counter. Across it, he saw a squat woman, old, with graying hair. Lester decided in his head to call her Mother, since she reminded him of Mother. Mother, Lester Burke said. "Oh, Lester baby, my good, beautiful baby Lester boy," the old woman replied. Reaching into her pocketbook, she pulled out a tiny chocolate chip cookie and placed it on the counter between them. Immediately, Lester Burke leaned forward and began to eat the cookie without using his hands. As he did this, he even hoped that the old woman would caress the back of his head with her slender fingers. Of course, the old woman did not do this, as she had never even met Lester before. But she also did not mind that he was eating a cookie off the counter without even using his hands. Lester Burke straightened, a cookie crumb falling from the corner of his mouth. The old woman looked at him. "I would like to pawn a locket," she said. Lester smiled. "Oh, I'm sorry, you've made a mistake, Mother. But don't worry, it happens all the time. I swear the mistake you made is quite common." As he spoke, he gestured around the cluttered shop at the shelves laden with boxes full of chess pieces, pawns of every size and shape. The old woman suddenly realized her mistake. "Oh, I'm sorry, how embarrassing. You have a nice day." With a lowered head, she walked back into the street. Less than a half hour later, a younger man, tall and thin, walked into the shop and smiled at Lester Burke. Someone else might have recognized this man as Alexis Zaslavsky, since he had been in the newspaper a few days before for his astounding accomplishment last week. Alexis worked as a public defender and had been handed an impossible task of defending a young man accused of murder in the first degree. The case against this young man seemed to be rock solid. DNA evidence, eyewitness testimony, even a recorded confession said that he was guilty. But Alexis Zaslavsky was able to prove him innocent within a few hours with a key piece of evidence he discovered. The key piece of evidence was that the young man was being accused of murdering none other than Alexis Zaslavsky himself. Alexis knew that the young man could not possibly have murdered him, seeing as he was still alive. So Alexis Zaslavsky went to the police station and showed them he was still alive. All the charges were dropped before the end of the day, and the young man walked free. For this quick and level-headed sleuthing, Alexis Zaslavsky had landed his name in the paper and become a minor neighborhood celebrity. Lester Burke, however, knew nothing about this, since Lester Burke did not have any shoes, and you can't go outside without shoes. "I would like to pawn this old guitar," said Alexis Zaslavsky. Lester Burke smiled. "I'm so sorry," he said. "You've mistaken this store for one of another kind." Alexis looked around, saw the pawns, turned red with embarrassment, and walked sheepishly back out onto the street without another word. After Alexis left, the store stayed quiet all afternoon. The tiny bell did not ring again until nearly 5 o'clock, when an older gentleman swung open the door, crossed to the counter, and spoke to Lester Burke. "I have an old mahogany chess set," he said, "but I am missing one of the black pawns, so I cannot play chess with it." Lester smiled knowingly. "I think I have just the thing to help you, sir." Lester reached up to a shelf behind the counter, picked up a black pawn, and placed it on the counter between him and the older gentleman. "Oh, yes, yes," the older gentleman cried. "This would be just the thing to replace my missing pawn. The only problem is that this pawn was made for a mahogany chess set bigger than mine, so if I used it with my mahogany chess set, it would stand out from the other pieces because it would be bigger than them." Lester nodded. "I see. Well, I might have just the thing for you then, sir," he said. This time, Lester Burke reached under the counter to a row of shelves that the older gentleman could not see. When his hand reappeared, it held a black pawn, smaller than the last, which he placed on the counter alongside the first. "Oh, holy cow, what joy!" The older gentleman, red in the face and sweating, screamed at the top of his lungs. "This would be an even better fit to replace my missing pawn, since it is the correct size. The only problem is that the pieces in my mahogany chess set are coated thickly with varnish, whereas this pawn, although the right size, is not. If I were to use this pawn with my mahogany chess set, it would stand out from the other pieces because of the difference in varnish." Lester Burke scratched his head and looked into the older gentleman's eyes. "I think I may have a pawn that will fulfill all your requirements." He reached back to the counter from which he had pulled the first pawn, but this time lifted a black pawn that was smaller than the first and covered with a thick coat of varnish. The older gentleman gulped in excitement. "Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Oh, yes, yes," the older gentleman said. "This pawn looks almost identical to those from my mahogany chess set. I will now be able to play chess with this new pawn, and no one will realize that it is any different than the other 7 black pawns from the original set." "So you would like to buy the pawn?" Lester Burke asked. "Yes, I would," said the older gentleman. "It costs $10, Lester Burke said. The older gentleman handed Lester a crumpled bill, took the pawn in a small paper bag, and walked out onto the street. I know you like the story since you're already fast asleep. Good night, Max.